really excited. So this is Hoedown Roundup, Active Directory Misconfigurations, Texas style. Yes. So about me. And I feel like a lot of people do this, but just kind of wanted to give you all a short introduction. I'm not just some random person wearing cowgirl boots. So offensive security engineer with 9 years of IT experience. The first 6 years of my career have been, the last 6 years have been dedicated to IT security, bachelor's degree in computer systems engineering, security operations, and incident detection. So although I'm currently working as a purple teamer, I've always felt that the security operations and the blue teamers are the unsung heroes of the industry. Like, everybody wants to be a pen tester and a hacker and cool and break into stuff, but security operations engineers always have to be right 100% of the time. Like, an attacker doesn't work a 9-to-5 schedule. Well, a pen tester can evaluate and assess an environment, write the report, and they're good to go. Security operations always has to be working, so just food for thought, I guess. And then there's like the boring alphabet soup, couple random facts about me. This is my first conference of the year and my second one across the pond. Prior talk was B-Sides Cambridge, and I was at 11 a.m. just kind of holding the line for lunch, so promise I'll try to keep it short. What is it that we're doing in here? So we're going to talk a little bit about Active Directory misconfigurations and how they could be abused. This is by no means a comprehensive guide. I would really like it if I could, use as much time as I could, but if I wanted to cover every single misconfiguration that has caused me really a hard time, it would take me a couple of days. So let's just think about this for a second. If Active Directory were a boyfriend, these are the red flags you want to be looking out for. So. Typically when you start your typical AD assessment, and I remember bringing this topic, mentioning to a couple of colleagues, hey, I want to talk about Active Directory misconfigurations. Okay, you do realize there's vulnerability assessments going on, right? You do know there's vulnerability scanners. Yes, we have vulnerability scanners, but a vulnerability scanner is not going to look at your Active Directory implementation. They might look at your domain controller, if patches are missing, permissions, but they're really not going to be looking at groups, at OUs, at, service accounts, and those are the ones we want to watch out for. Another thing that I get is, okay, there's third-party pen testing firms that can look at our stuff, and yes, but ask yourself, do you really want to be the person that needs somebody else to tell you what you should be doing when you know already you can be proactive? So you want to take that proactive approach and decrease the chances of potentially getting compromised. Again, nothing is unhackable, but if somebody's going to break into your stuff, make them work for it. Don't put it in a silver platter. So, the switchman. So I typically like to start my presentations with a little bit of a random story or a random fact, and So, promise this totally has something to do with Active Directory, so correlated to the main presentation. So in 1952, Mexican writer Juan José Arreola published a compilation of short stories with one of his main stories titled The Switchman. It's about this traveler trying to get to this really ambiguous place called T-Town. And he gets to a train station, and he finds an old employee from that train station, calls himself the Switchman, and tells him, you know what? You're not going to get to T-Town. Not going to happen, not today, not tomorrow, who knows? So here's the deal. We really don't follow a schedule for our trains. We don't really respect tickets. We don't use IDs to identify passengers. People come and go as they please. Trains are broken. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Moral of the story, when a service is unpredictable, makes it very expensive and makes it useless. And this is something that we see with Active Directory bad implementations too. Domain controllers. So we all know what a domain controller is. We're really not going to reinvent the wheel. We're just going to take this as a little refresher. So this is a type of servers that are responsible for responding to authentication requests and verifying users on computer networks. So they provide a structure for coordinating users and computers on the same network. The domain controller plays a role organizing and securing all relevant data within that domain. So let's just think as a domain controller as a type of server that processes authentication requests based on existing directory permissions. Let's just think, for example, Karen from accounting is like all nosy and wants to know what's going on in other people's shared drives, but oh, surprise, surprise, she doesn't have permissions. That's when a domain controller comes to place processing authentication requests when she's attempting to access a network resource. So, hold your horses. That's a phrase I use a lot. Okay, we want to start an assessment and we want to start breaking into stuff and playing hacker and doing all the fun parts, but we really can't do that just yet. We also want to make sure that we got certain things and we're meeting certain requirements before we start. So, first thing we need, authorization. So, if it's not documented, it didn't happen, right? So that pretty much applies for anything in this case. So make sure you have written documentation. It's like, hey, you got the permission to perform this testing. Here it is. So this is in the event that something goes awfully wrong. You have something to cover yourself with. You also need a defined scope. You need your domain controllers. You need your IP ranges, computers. Like make sure you stay in scope no matter what. You need to define the type of testing, evasive, hybrid evasive, non-evasive. If anything, it's a no-no. For example, you find a host that is vulnerable to a DOS exploit. Do you really want to use it? A lot of the times that's a big no-no. Also, you want to use this opportunity to test your security controls, right? Active Directory, it's not just, okay, I'm going to see if I can get domain admin. Make the best out of your assessments. Like make sure if you're getting, like the logs that you need, if your correlation searches on your SIEM are detecting this type of activity, if your EDR is responding. So this is a good opportunity for like an IT security exercise in general. You also want to have a defined timeline, and this is typically based on the type of the scope of the assessment. You want a testing schedule, especially when it comes to a domain controller being such a sensitive component of Active Directory and could potentially affect other services at SSO. You also want a communication plan avoiding disruptions, and I have a really bad story about this. And typically, okay, you're testing something and you are using a tool that your EDR would typically pick up, right? In an ideal world, your host gets isolated, gets quarantined. You're not able to test anymore, right? So what happens? You reach out to your security operations team. It's like, hey, can you bring my host back online? Oh, that was you. Okay, good. I'll bring your host back online, but moral of the story, you're not only creating more work for them, you're interrupting your own work. So try to keep everybody in the loop and just make sure that every single stakeholder is aware of what's going on. Another thing we need a good documentation process, keeping note of your findings. So make it easier on yourself. At the end of the day, your report is the end product that you're going to be presenting. Just because this is an internal assessment doesn't necessarily mean you don't really need to put any attention on the report. So at the end of the day, this is where you present your findings. So it's your time to shine. Make the best out of it. Reporting plan, processes and stakeholders. So what does this even mean? So know your target audience, right? So your IT manager that's not technical a lot of the times are really not going to care how many hours it took you to crack a hash or how you created that word list. They're going to want to look at the bigger picture and how this could potentially affect the organization versus your system administrator that wants a more granular description of how you came to the conclusion that, there are changes that need to be done. So another thing you need before an assessment, you need a domain join host. So that might appear to be like a dead giveaway, but if you're testing more than one domain in an assessment, you might not always get a domain join host. So you might want to get a little bit more creative, spin, like an instance of Kali, Parrot, and just kind of get a little bit more creative from there. You need a recovery plan. So basically, if you break something, just make sure you're able to bring it back. So snapshots, backups, just make sure you have that handy. You also need access credentials, and they need to be valid credentials with appropriate permissions based on the domain that you're testing. So what kind of permissions do we need? Well, that really boils down to your target goals in the assessment, but my experience, my suggestion is always go for the very bare minimum amount of permissions in the event that you want to see how you escalate privileges or how like a very average Joe user could really break into something and cause the most damage. So, one thing to keep in mind, the documentation required prior to an assessment is going to be different, an internal assessment to an external assessment. So internal assessments, typically rely on existing documentation, like, okay, I have this on my SharePoint, I have this on my Confluence, my vulnerability scanner is going to give me this information. Versus like a third-party assessment, it's a lot more red tape. Like typically you have like a scoping call, like a scoping questionnaire, and you have rules of engagement, and you have your NDA. And a lot of the times internally, those are predefined the moment that you're working for a company. You're not gonna be publicly disclosing information. So just something to keep in mind. Okay, so we already know all the cool stuff that we need before we start testing, like everything that we need. Now we're gonna start gathering information. So we need our domain name, we need our domain controllers. Most of the times we're gonna be evaluating more than one domain controller, and why is this? Well, organizations typically have more than one domain controller because high availability reasons or different places in geographic areas or workload balancing, whatever reason, it's going to be more than one most of the times. Trust relationships to see how two domains communicate with each other and how they share resources. You want to look at group memberships, like your high value targets. Who is an enterprise admin? Who is a domain admin? Or even if it's not something that appears to be like useful, it could be a group membership that involves an external service or an application that could, give you hints for you to move a little bit forward. You also want to look at group policies and service accounts. This is one of my favorites because a lot of the times we give service accounts more permissions than what they actually need. So you see service accounts with domain admin. Does it really need to be a domain admin? So. Security controls and monitoring. So you want to use this opportunity, like I said before, to work with your security operations team and see if everything is, like your controls are responding the way they should be. In this very specific case, I made a very generic domain, just kind of, like for demo purposes. User account Melina Phillips, Texas Corp local. So extremely secure password, totally go for it. Recommended. And so how do we gather information? This is all nice and fun and all that stuff, but truly, how do we gather information? This is a tool that I typically like using. I did not create it, but I find it really helpful. It's called LDAP domain dump. So here I'm specifying the name of my domain, my user account, and my password. So I'm going to see what kind of information does it give me. So I can see, I get my domain computers, groups, policies, trusts, basically everything that I just mentioned. And the beauty of it is that it lets me grab information and it presents it in a format that makes it a little bit easier. Like lots of people go for Bloodhound and, that's good. You don't have to be married to one particular tool, but you also want to make it easier on yourself. In this case, I can see my domain trusts. I have 2 additional trusts. And this goes back to what I mentioned before. Whenever you're scoping this type of assessments, make sure that your scope isn't limited to just one single trust, unless they tell you specifically or otherwise, something to keep in mind. And in here, it also gives me the opportunity to look at user accounts. Like I was saying before, a lot of the times, we're giving service accounts more permissions than what they need. In this case, I see an SVC task. I see the group memberships. And you also want to look at account descriptions. You never know what you're going to find. Like, I've seen instances of people putting passwords in accounts descriptions. And I remember the first time I saw it, it wasn't for a domain admin, but it was for a higher privilege account. So, like I said, in this case, same password for all domains. So what does this tell me? Our password policies are bad. And here, for executed automated scripts, this guy likes his chicken salad. This is always something interesting to be looking at. So, next, assessment tools examples. So rather than looking at a particular tool, I want us to think of the methodology. Like, if I were a bad person and I wanted to break into something, what kind of intel and what kind of information would I need? Like I said before, you don't want to get married to a tool for different reasons. Sometimes they stop working on the project. Sometimes the developer goes like, this ain't fun anymore. I'm just going to go outside or become a makeup artist or travel the world. So a lot of the times your EDR, is going to pick up the tool pretty quickly, or you don't have a domain join host, and it's hard for you to just be deploying that tool. So these are tools I'm pretty sure you guys have heard of before. Personal favorites, LDAP domain dump, which is the one I just showed y'all, LDAPsearch, PowerShell Active Directory module. I love it. I know that some people might want to throw tomatoes at me, but it's a really useful tool. So, Lone Star Insights. These are pretty much like honorable mentions. Things to keep in mind, like some of the biggest red flags whenever you're evaluating, and these are simple and really ordinary and generic, but if you think about them, we still see them, and we still see them in production, and it's sad and it's scary at the same time. So, outdated SMB versions, like I've done assessments where I still see SMB version 1. And as we see that, we know that's still vulnerable, like Configure, Eternal Blue. So whenever you're playing Hack the Box or just kind of goofing off with your friends, that's the very first exploit that they make you run, like Eternal Blue. You get your little shell and like, I'm a hacker. So lack of replication amongst domain controllers. So this is particularly concerning. When changes don't get propagated amongst them, what happens is there are permissions issues in the end. And there are tools that systems administrators can run, like rep admin, and look at the event viewer. But if you want to get a little bit more creative, you might want to work with your security operations team and create correlation searches, like make sure you're ingesting the correct logs. I think it's 1925 for domain controller replication failures. So, and based on those logs, you want to create, alerts like, hey, this is going on. Again, never, ever, ever rely on just one tool to do all the work. So it's also a responsibility to keep an eye on things that could potentially go wrong. Another misconfiguration, print spooler is enabled on domain controllers. Oh no. Your domain controller should be a single role type of server. In this case, we're talking about print spoolers, right? But I've seen people installing like multiple browsers on their DCs, or Microsoft, like Teams, or tools that they shouldn't really be using. So if you're not using something, no need to keep it there. Outdated in the EDR sensor, that's another misconfiguration. Delegation misconfiguration, that's another thing that I've seen before. So think about this as our ability to impersonate accounts. I remember back in the day when I used to work the service desk, and I was just goofing off with a friend. We were covering like the night shift. It was a holiday, and I was like, hey, can you give me permissions on Active Directory for this account? Can you add me to this group? How about you go add yourself? And I was like, okay, I'll add myself. And surprise, surprise, I was able to add myself. Back then, I thought it was amazing. Right now, not so much. So. Certificate template permissions. So this is a topic that going in depth would probably take me the rest of the hour. But this is basically the baseline of how Active Directory certificate services abuse would happen. So think of a template as a predefined set of rules and settings for creating certificates. Improperly setting these permissions on certificate templates is going to let an attacker issue their own certificates and let them escalate privileges and compromise the network. Basically, we're impersonating somebody else and just authenticating via certificate. So that's pretty concerning if you think about it. And then we're going to start getting our hands a little bit dirtier. Hopefully, I didn't put anybody to sleep just yet. Common misconfigurations. SMB signing being disabled. So when SMB signing is enabled, every message is sent along with a signature embedded in the SMB header. And the signature is crafted by encrypting the SMB message contents using the AES algorithm. So think of this, for example, as a way of validating the authenticity and the integrity of our message. When SMB signing is disabled, that's when like man-in-the-middle attacks happen, SMB relay could happen, and that's when you can get all the goodies and potentially use them later on. Obviously, this could be changed directly in the group policy management. If you go to policies, Windows settings, local policies, security options. But again, in an internal assessment, 9 out of 10 times, they're not going to give you access to your domain controller right away. So it's up to you just to kind of get creative and find a way to enumerate this. I normally like PowerShell scripts and just kind of indicate the path that you need to be working with. And in this case, I'm indicating the registry value that I need to check if SMB signing is disabled or not. In this case, for this purpose, I left it as disabled, just kind of to show you guys. Another misconfiguration is improper trust relationships. So securing trust relationships is important. This could be potentially abused. You want to do it for identity management purposes, and you want to improve incident response. That's a reason to keep it in mind. So when I say improving incident response for trust relationships, this is just imagine you get compromised, right? So we want to evaluate the scope of the damage, like, okay, how bad was this hacker able to hit me? What else were they able to have resources to? Not just my domain, but some, like another internal domain. You also want it for infrastructure optimization. You want to avoid administration overhead, like sysadmins are already busy and have a lot going on as they are. So just, that's one more thing to check for. So it's typical, get AD trust with PowerShell. You can also get it through LDAP domain dump, like I was mentioning before. I can see that I have 2 trusts in here. Another thing I've seen in the past, trust relationships to domains that are no longer valid. Domains that are no longer valid, like, okay, there is a company merger, there was this old domain, there's still a trust. Oh, okay, we're no longer using that domain, and there's still a trust, so. Another thing to look for or keep in mind, another misconfiguration, weak password policies. So you want to keep a uniform criteria across domains. When it comes to password policies, you want to enhance security and make it easy to manage. One thing that I've seen before in the past, and this is really sad to see, like, okay, I have a test domain that I'm just going to use it to play with like my group, and I'm not going to be implementing changes in production. This is just a test domain. And it has a weak password policy. And the excuse would be, okay, this is not production. All right, this is not production, but an attacker is really not going to look at it that way. They're going to try to find a way to pivot. Besides, think about it for a second. It only takes one bad action for us to make it into a habit. We don't want to do that. We're better than that. So you can get this information, again, from PowerShell. You want to look at your password policy. PowerShell can give you that. Also from the typical standard command line. You can get that too. Again, with LDAP domain dump. And here I was just goofing off and being silly and just kind of giving like irrational password policies. This one, like, it doesn't lock me out, woohoo! And 364 days is the maximum password age. So yeah, always make sure that you're keeping a good password policy. It's important. Another misconfiguration, scripts and sysvol, and this is something that I've seen in production as well. So if passwords or sensitive information are stored in these scripts, they could be at risk of exposure. So access to this volume, including the scripts folder, is typically available to all authenticated users. You don't even need to be like a high-level user. You can just be like a random, ordinary, like average Joe, and you're going to have access to this volume. So it's crucial to ensure that scripts do not contain plain text passwords or any sensitive data. So when I found this the first time in production, I wasn't even in IT security. I was I don't want to say just starting my career, but I was doing service desk work. And while it didn't really give me a valid password, it gave me like a good visibility of what did the password pattern look like. So it was using something like winter 2016. So what does this tell me? Winter 2017 or spring 2017. So that was the pattern that was in use. So you can get this with SMB clients, specifying your domain controller. And like I said, you have to make sure you have a valid username. It doesn't even have to be like a high-level credential. So this is pretty much what I'm getting, how I'm getting it, specifying the name of my domain controller, sysvolume, my username. Surprise, surprise, I am accessing Texas Corp, and I'm going to see if I have something in my share. And I can see it. I have access to the scripts folder. And I'm going to try to see what's in this script. Obviously, I'm going to find credentials for demo purposes. But just kind of trying to show you guys, this is something that I've seen in the real world. And it was a little bit concerning when I found it. So I thought it was really cool back then. Right now, like I said, not so much. So yeah, I can see I have a username and I have a valid password in here. So going a little bit further, I'm going to see if these are valid credentials. Okay, I'm able to log in with these credentials. Whenever you get a shell, the first thing you want to do is, who am I? So I want to look at what groups am I a part of. So in here, I can see that I am a domain admin, sure. So TGS tickets. This is one of my favorite topics, and it's kind of sad that I don't really get to talk about it as much as I would enjoy. So TGS tickets are a crucial part of Kerberos authentication. So we know that Kerberos has three main components, like a key distribution center, a ticket granting ticket, and an authentication server. When a user logs into a Windows system, they first authenticate with the domain controller and obtain a ticket granting ticket. So once the user has a ticket granting ticket, they send a request on resources to the network, and they do this by sending a request to the ticket granting service with the domain controller. And the TGS is going to respond by giving them a TGS ticket, like, okay, here's your ticket, and here's your information containing user information and information on the requested resource, right? So TGS tickets are not even, like a misconfiguration per se. This is an existing Windows feature, right? It's us. We are the ones who turn it into a misconfiguration. How? By using weak passwords, by avoiding account rotation, by not checking our permissions. So this is when an attacker really starts getting creative and they start abusing and playing with things they shouldn't be playing with. So obtaining a TGS ticket is really easy. You don't even need to be a privileged account. You can just be like any random average Joe or Karen from Human Resources being all frustrated, just even her. So get users SPN. This is a tool I like using. A lot of people like CrackMapExec. So this is pretty much how we would create a ticket, specify our domain, username and password, domain controller, and we make this request. So boom, gives me my ticket. But all of this, like I'm getting the name of the account, the group membership, the name of my domain. All of this appears to be useless, okay? It's just like a random encrypted, like hash, whatever. This is how we learn that we need to crack them. So it is possible to crack these tickets. You can just copy the extracted hash into a file, rule-based attacks to increase password efficiency, and wow, awesome. So yeah, rule-based attacks. Rule-based attacks are good. Another thing you can do, you can play around with word lists There's crunch and there's cool, but basically the moral of the story here is you want to make it granular to your organization, right? Let's just say you work for, I don't know, are we allowed to say company names? Let's just say that you work for, I don't know, Victoria's Secret or Sephora or whatever. Just make it related to your job or terminology that's internal, right? So terms that you know you would use within your company, or you can create them, like I said, with those tools, just kind of have some fun with the word lists. Consider using a dedicated hardware, such as a high-performance GPU or a dedicated cracking rig. Oh my gosh, so I remember where I was just like cracking my first hash. I used to do it, don't do this is embarrassing, but whatever, through just like a VM. Like I didn't have a cracking rig, I was just like, I'm gonna use my VM to crack a hash. Terrible. So, implement proper security measures to protect extracted hashes. So if you're able to grab a hash from an account, still treat it, like carefully. Just because you're not able to crack a hash and it's not in plain text doesn't mean somebody else won't be able to get that for you. So if you have access to a privileged account management solution, like anything that is out there, you can create a folder and just add whoever is involved with the assessment and keep this information protected. So typically this is how I would do it. Just crack me TXT is where I'm storing my hash. So what I'm gonna do is run hashcat 13100. This is for TGS tickets. Generated output is just gonna, store the output in a text file. Crack me TXT is where I'm storing it. And this is the word list that I created. So I disable the pod file just because I want my hash in there to be displayed. So there it is. I don't really know why it came up as a candidate too, but even from candidates, you can get this information and get a little bit more creative and twist it to potentially be able to use it and play with it a little bit more. So there it is, administrator 1 to 3. So, okay. Neglecting privilege groups. That is another misconfiguration that I see too. You want to be able to identify disabled accounts. You want to see a need to know, take the time, within the year to evaluate, does this person really need access to this group? Do they really need to be able to view this information or the contents of this shared drive or access this location? You also want to simplify management and you want to ensure compliance. Depending on the type of information and the type of organization, a lot of the times these exercises are done for compliance reasons too. So this is the messiest script ever in history, but it turns out to be really useful. So just kind of play with it. It's a lot of grepping. It's a lot of extracting. So here's the name of my domain controller, username and password, and I'm looking at this three particular concerning groups: domain admins, enterprise, and schema admins. You also want to look at accounts that are enabled and disabled too. And you want to extract the account description as well. So in here, just kind of getting a little bit more creative, and it's going to give me, okay, I have several accounts in privileged groups, and these accounts are disabled too. So something else to keep in mind. Same password for all domains. Always look at your descriptions. Those are important too. One more misconfiguration, abusing obtained credentials. This is sync attack. So let's just say that we already have domain admin credentials. What are we able to do with them? So we want to cause the most damage, right? And have the most fun. So in order for this attack to be successful, domain admin privileges are required. You could also do this with enterprise admin. But more specifically, it needs to the following extended privileges, which is DS replication changes and DS replication get changes all. So basically, what does a DC sync attack entail? Well, this happens whenever an attacker tries to impersonate a domain controller and perform a replication action. It's like, hey, I'm a domain controller. Can I get information regarding, your passwords and your usernames? And okay, sure, you're a domain controller. I'm gonna send you this information right away. So In here, for example, this is the same account that I found before, SVC LDAP, with the password that was seen in that description. And I am going to be dumping all my LSA secrets. And this is what pretty much would look like. So, no authenticated scans. This is not a misconfiguration per se, but it's something messy that I've seen in the past, and I've seen it happening too. You want to get results accuracy, right? So you have to make sure that your domain controllers are part of your authenticated scans in whatever vulnerability scanning engine you're looking at. For detection of complex vulnerabilities, and you want to do it for compliance reasons, like I said before, depending on the organization. So really generic, you just set up like privileged credentials or anything that is able to access your domain controller. And I set up a really generic instance with OpenVAS, not my favorite scanner. But what I'm doing right now is evaluating my domain controller. In here, I'm checking that I'm using the service account that I mentioned before, SVC scanner. And what I'm going to do next is I'm going to look at everything that gets checked within an authenticated scan. So in here, I'm making sure that I'm targeting the correct domain, Dallas, DC. And I'm going to be checking, what does an authenticated scan entail? All right. So I'm going to check, what results did it give me? What's in there? I can see that I was able to log into SMB. In here is showing as successful. And I can see that access to the registry was possible through SMB. That is correct. And I can see in here that my domain controller, the 129 IP address, was the one that was scanned. So pretty much like a checklist of things. This is one of our last points to look at. Lack of user access review. We're almost done. Access retention during department transfers. And this is something, again, that I've experienced. I had the privilege of working with this guy. He's really, really amazing. He used to be a system administrator. They put him in the security team. So anyway, so he was basically dragging all permissions from his old role into the security team. Again, he was able to make changes to Auth365, administrator privileges. To us, it was amazing because it was good to have like somebody do all that work for us. But at the same time, in theory, it was not right to do that. For cross-domain account analysis, if you have the same account in different domains, you want to make sure that, do I truly need this permissions? Is this okay? Is this correct? Whenever you're wrapping up projects or for contractor access management, contractors typically have to sign an NDA based on the type of organization or information that is being managed. So we don't want to give people more permissions than what they truly need. Wrapping up. Hopefully I didn't put y'all to sleep. All right, final thoughts. 5 P's. Prior preparation prevents poor performance. I love that phrase. Say that 5 times. So, yeah, just make sure you have everything you need whenever you are, before you're performing an assessment. Most importantly, make sure you have permissions. Make sure you stay in scope. And if you do break something, make sure you have a way to bring it back. Rinse and repeat, stay consistent. So I had somebody asking me yesterday, and I love that question, and I love it when people ask me that question. What do you think is the biggest misconfiguration in Active Directory? And I said, it's not Active Directory per se, it's the way we treat it. We treat it as a one-time type of implementation, and it shouldn't be like that. It's something we need to be constantly evaluating. So let's just think of IT solutions as skincare. For 2 reasons. Just because something works for one of our friends doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to work for us. And 2, as we get older, the stuff that we need changes, and we need to be more careful. So don't put all your eggs in one basket. So don't rely on just one single tool to do all the work, right? So this applies also for security controls. Don't say, okay, I have my EDR, I'm good to go, woo! So you want to take defense in depth or a layered security type of approach. right? So if something doesn't work, okay, I have this other level of control or this other additional level of security. And then last but not least, collaboration. Security is a team sport. It's not just the pen tester evaluating your environment. It's not just the security operations team, like creating correlation searches. It's not just the security engineer deploying this type of solutions that are, like giving us our logs. It's not just the CISO overseeing all of this happening. It's everybody. We're all in this together. So, and that's it.
Thank you so much. That was great.